Hi, everybody. Brian Valerio, Vice President in the Proxy Solicitation Group at Alliance Advisors. And today I'm joined by Michael Spelman, who heads up the Business Development Group for Proxy Issues at Toppan Merrill. And Mike, let's talk today a little bit, if you have some time, about the advantages of doing notice and access and also some of the advantages of full set delivery and which company it makes sense to do each respective process for.
Sure, and thanks for having me, Brian. I appreciate it. You know, notice and access, it's a double-edged sword. I think that there's a lot of positive, but a lot of downside to it as well. The benefit of full set delivery is that the investor is assured of getting the proxy materials in front of them, the voting materials, directions to proxyvote.com, for instance, to enroll in a more practical solution, which is electronic delivery. With more and more regulation and rules coming down from the SEC in regards to proxy access, say on pay, and various other things that are affecting publicly traded companies on a routine basis, it's more important now today for that shareholder to be engaged. The broker discretionary vote is long gone. So now the brokers can no longer vote on behalf of the investor.
Well, it depends on the proposal, right? And it depends on how the New York Stock Exchange deems it. But
that is correct.
There are more limited abilities to vote on behalf of the shareholder.
Right. So the recipient of a notice of internet availability form, which falls under the notice and access rules, are really directed to a website to view the materials and a second website to vote their shares online. Broadridge had published stats a few years back that showed that the overwhelming majority of those recipients were ignoring the notice of internet availability form. So essentially, that's a lost opportunity to get your message in front of the investor. And while companies like Amazon and Microsoft and Walmart, who have millions of investors, perhaps maybe with 2, 3, 5, 10 shares of stock, they're not overly concerned about connecting with a lot of those smaller investors. They want to hit the large retail folks, et cetera, et cetera. So it makes sense for companies like them to eliminate to have to produce those shareholder reports. So there's some cost savings associated with that. But the downside to notice and access, outside of just the lack of connectivity, are the costs associated with it. So there are processing fees, form fees, envelopes, postage, and ancillary services like document conversions and inventory management. And of course, the potential fulfillment requests that come from investors that did receive that notice of internet availability form. More than 80% of publicly traded companies actually pay as much or more to utilize notice and access than if they just printed full set and mailed.
Wow, I don't think that's something that many people realize. I think one of the real advantages to notice and access in people's minds is it's viewed as a real cost saver.
Yeah, and that's not true. It is a cost saver, as I mentioned before, the aforementioned Walmart, Microsoft, Amazon, but the overwhelming majority of publicly traded companies don't have that kind of shareholder base. So when the base processing fees come into play, and there's a tiered pricing models, subscribed, through the Broadridge offering, transfer agents also offer for the registered distribution notice and access services. Those startup costs exceed what it would cost to print full set and mail. So we've done thousands of analyses over the past 15, 20 years. Well, at least since notice and access came into play, I think around 2007. So that's 13 years. I'm getting my math wrong there a little bit, but the reality is that it is a viable offering for large publicly traded companies who really are not overly concerned about connecting with the smaller investor base. If you have a large retail base, companies like Disney, companies perhaps maybe like Procter & Gamble, I strongly recommend that they look at those shareholder bases, and even though they'll save money using the notice and access model, they should stratify their mailings just to make sure that investors with at least 100 shares or more are being sent proxy materials.
And on that note, it's almost more of a marketing tool for those companies at that point, right? Because they have beautiful materials and they can get them in the hands of their holders, and there can be some real pride in owning that company.
Oh, I totally agree. And again, this is all about shareholder connectivity at the end of the day. Even though I represent a manufacturing firm, I do recognize the ease and cost effectiveness of the electronic delivery model. So it's a huge distinction between voluntary electronic delivery and notice and access. And e-delivery, the e-recipient is more likely to participate in the process than those receiving a notice of internet availability form. So at the end of the day, we advise our clients, hey, create a call to action within the body of your proxy materials to continue to drive those e-numbers up, and over a space of time, your print numbers will come down. Notice and access is a static fee. Year over year, you're paying that same processing fees, and quite frankly, you're really kind of, just running in place. You're not saving anything. So improve shareholder connectivity, keep costs to a minimum. You can still connect with your investors. E-delivery model is a much better way to connect with those shareholders.
The main theme that I'm hearing, though, is that you really need to take stock, for lack of a better term, in your company's shareholder base and the makeup of your company's shareholder base in order to make an educated decision about what's going to be the best way to distribute the materials to your specific shareholder base. There's really not a one-size-fits-all solutions here. It definitely depends on the level of retail ownership versus the level of large institutional ownership. Is that pretty much the main concern?
Exactly correct. Exactly. Understand the demographics of your shareholder base as well, if possible. Sometimes, as I mentioned before, companies like Procter & Gamble, even Macy's, Midwest companies, both in Cincinnati, that was a coincidence. Midwest companies that have older retail shareholders still like those hard copies. And they'll call the investor relations department up to make sure that they get those samples each year. Know your shareholder base. Make sure you're connecting with them. If, in fact, you have non-routine proposals in the body of your proxy statement, it's even more critical to make sure that you get those materials into their hands.
That was going to be my next point about also analyzing the proposals that you have on the ballot. And what are the touch points and what are the vote requirements for those proposals? Do you need a majority of the outstanding on a routine or a non-routine item? If that's the case, then maybe you really want to consider, if you're going to be doing an outgoing retail call campaign, having some full set materials delivered, maybe in that stratified model as you discussed, as a primer for those materials prior to making retail calls. Is that something you've come across?
Oh yeah, many times. I think it just makes perfect sense to understand that, hey, we're going to need the vote on these proposals. Let's make sure that we're getting these materials into the hands of the investors. And quite frankly, as I mentioned before, the notice of internet availability form is just not a very effective way of communicating that information to your investor.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. The big takeaway that I'm going to take from this is I really have to spend some time with my clients and analyze their shareholder base before making a determination as to what's the best way to distribute the materials. It might be notice and access, it might be full set, it might be a stratified approach.
Yeah, and one last thing though, the other downside to notice and access is the stringent timeline that's required. The mailings need to be completed 40 days prior to the annual meeting. There's no flexibility. Should you encroach upon that 40-day window and need extra time in getting the materials to Broadridge, there's no way that you can go notice and access. You will then be required to go full set. So it's the timeline could be a challenge for many issuers.
That's a great point, and that's something that I'll definitely keep in mind going forward.
Excellent, Brian. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike. Really appreciate you joining me today.
All right. Have a good one.
You too.